Hello guys, in this video we are going to talk about local and shared object repository. Like in the last video we have discussed about what's an object repository. So what's an object repository? Object repository is a place where QTP stores attribute of an object. Okay, so consider this is a place where QTP stores all the objects. So browser is an object, page is an object, and web edit is an object. It stores information about the object in the object repository. So in this video we are going to talk about local versus shared object repository. Before we go into the object repository, we should know about the object recognition. Okay, so how QTP recognize the object. QTP has property called mandatory property, assistive property, and ordinal identifier. What is this? It has predefined some of the properties that are mandatory for an object type. So suppose there is a web edit box. Okay, so it has defined some of the property that are mandatory for an web edit box. So whether these properties are present on the application or not, it's going to add those property. If it's not able to identify those property, then it will look into an assistive property. Okay, so let me show you the example so we can better understand this concept. So what we have created new GUI test under which there is one action, and this is local repository. So I'm going to click on local repository. Okay, so in the last example we have added login, password, and sign in button. Okay, so if I talk about login, so you can read about it's saying descriptive property, what is type, name, and HTML tag. So these three property are mandatory property for an web edit box. How I know about that these are mandatory property? You can go under tools, object identification. Okay, so you can see that there are two type of property, mandatory property and assistive property. I will change this into a web. Okay, under web I'll go into web edit. So now you can also see that these property are defined as a mandatory properties. So suppose a object is able to identify using these three property, then QTP will not use any assistive property to identify an object. Okay, but if suppose QTP is not able to identify an object using this mandatory property, then it starts adding these assistive property one by one until a match is found. So in what condition, like if all the mandatory and assistive properties are same, then it going to use ordinal identifier. In this case it's none because QTP is able to identify an object using the mandatory properties. So I can change the ordinal identifier and use as an index. Okay, suppose there were 3 or 4 login at web edit box which have the same property, then I have to choose the identifier as an index, and according to a index I can choose which web edit I am talking about. So guys, I think I am clear about this thing. There are 3 types of properties. One is mandatory, second is the assistive, and third is the ordinal identifier. So what's an local and shared object repository and why we need them? This is a good question. So local object repository is associated as a per action basis. Okay, if an local URL is associated with a login page. So it will be available to only login page. Let me just show you. See, you can also read this as a local. Okay, so this login object repository is only available to action 1. Suppose if I create another action and say add call to new action and just name it as action 2. See, in this object repository there is no login web edit because it is only associated with action 1. So that's why login local object repository is only associated with its corresponding action. Okay, so what's an shared object repository? If we go to resource and open object repository manager, then if I add an object here, okay, now if I save this object repository to a desktop, okay, as an object repository, so now what I did, I opened the object repository manager, I've added one object and save it to my desktop. So now I can use this object to associate with my local action. So what's a local and what's a shared? In a local, I can associate my object repository to my local action only. In shared, I can use an shared object repository to associate with my many action. So here, in an example, action 2 does not have any local repository. So what we are going to do, we have exported the shared object repository. We are going to associate that shared object repository with action 2. We can double click on local, or we can also use Ctrl R to open an object repository. Then we are going to click on tools, then associate repository. Then we are going to give the location, that is my desktop. Okay, so what it's asking, that you have associated a shared object repository, in which action you want to associate with. I am going to associate with action 2 and we'll click on OK. So now if you look into action 2, there is an login thing. Okay, what's it saying, that now it's associated login to its local repository. I can also copy this object to its local. See this, copy. So now a shared object repository is associated with the action 2. See, I can right click and click on copy to local. If I click on copy to local, it will copy its all the property and it will associate the copied object to its local repository. So I'm going to let it remain as it is. Also, I'm going to show you one feature in local repository, that once you add an object into local repository, in the later time, if you want that this should become my shared object repository, you can use export local object. It will export as again .tsr file, which is equivalent to shared object repository, and you can use this object repository to associate with more action. One more feature I am going to show you is there is a feature of learn, navigate and learn. Suppose there are 10 web edit box in a web page, and I am going to make a shared object repository. So adding all the web edit box is very tedious. So there is an option in which QTP learns about the web edit box. You can go to object and click on navigate and learn. Here you can select and filter and then select which type of object you want to select. I am here want to select all the edit box, so I have clicked on edit box and click on OK, and then again click on OK. Then I will click on learn. So what it does, it learn all the web edit box on a web page. So there were two web edit box, login and password. It added those in my shared object repository. So I think it's a very handy technique if you want to add many objects and associate with it with many action. So suppose there were 100 objects on a web page, so adding one by one will be very tedious. In this way you can add it simultaneously. So guys, thank you for watching this video, and before we wrap up this video, I'm going to revisit this thing that we have talked about mandatory properties that QTP will add. Whether these properties are there or not, it's going to add this property because these are explicitly defined. If QTP is not able to identify these property, then it will use assistive property. Suppose both of these properties are not sufficient enough, then it's going to use ordinal identifier. Third, what is local and shared? Local is object repository that is associated with a per action basis. It is not available to other action. In shared object repository, we can associate an object repository with many actions. So in a scenario in which suppose there is a language thing, English language, there is a German language, there is a Dutch language. I have created a language object repository and I created a common scenario. So according to that scenario, I can associate that object repository to an action basis. Suppose in a login, there is a German login, there is a Dutch login, there is a French login, so I can create an object repository for different languages and associate with login action. So I think this is clear. So guys, thank you for watching this video.